Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to today's talk titled The Trial That Shook Britain, How a Court-Martial Hastened Acceptance of Indian Independence by Mr. Ashis Ray. November 5th, 1945 is not a day that's etched in the memory of most Indians. However, it was that day when the INA court-martial or military trial began at Delhi's Red Fort. The three men on trial, a Muslim, a Sikh, and a Hindu, were Captain Shahnawaz Khan and Lieutenant Gurbaksh Singh Dhillon, both of the 1st Battalion, 14th Punjab Regiment, and Captain Prem Kumar Sehgal of the 2nd Battalion, 10th Baluch Regiment, all of whom had deserted the British Indian Army to join the Indian National Army, or the INA, where they became senior commanders. In its first incarnation in 1941-42, the INA was formed with Indian prisoners of war held by Japan during World War II and headed by Mohan Singh, a former officer of the British Indian Army, and the Bengali revolutionary Rashbihari Bose. In its more famous and second avatar in 1943, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose formed the provisional government of Azad Hind, or Free India, right here in Singapore. He greatly expanded the INA's strength to about 40,000 and extended recruitment to the mainly Tamil community of Malaya and Singapore. While most of you in this room are probably aware of the fate of the INA and Subhash Bose, less is probably known about the Red Fort trial that happened between 45 to 46. The trial saw Jawaharlal Nehru, among others, donning his long neglected lawyer's robe and wig. He was one of the 17-member team of prominent lawyers defending Shahnawaz, Sehgal, and Dhillon. The trial, which occurred during the end game of empire and the rush of events that led to Indian independence in 1947, has remained a somewhat neglected part of the history of the Indian nationalist movement. To talk about the INA trial and its ramifications, we have Mr. Ashis Ray, who has recently authored a book on this subject. I believe it came out late last year in November. You all have Mr. Ray's bio with you. Nevertheless, let me introduce him very briefly. Mr. Ashis Ray has been a foreign correspondent since 1977, broadcasting on BBC, CNN, and ITN, and writing for the Ananda Bazar Group, the Times of India, the Tribune, the Hindu, Hindustan Times, Guardian, the Observer, the Times, Financial Times, and a host of other publications. He was CNN's founding South Asia bureau chief before becoming the network's editor-at-large in London. He was an academic visitor at St. Antony's College, Oxford, from 2021 to 2022. The Trial That Shook Britain is his 4th book. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Routledge. Ladies and gentlemen of learning and friends. It's a great pleasure to be here in Singapore for the simple reason that the topic I'm about to address has origins in Singapore. The trial of 3 officers previously of the British-commanded Indian Army who defected to what was called the Indian National Army took place right here. And therefore, the birthplace of the Indian National Army is Singapore. But let me thank the Institute for organizing this event. And I should also like to, in that same vein, thank Indorama, who have facilitated my visit to Singapore. And so the combination has worked in us being at this venue today. I went to Oxford to explore the question as to how the Indian freedom movement was revived after the Second World War. Now, why was I asking that question? Quite simply because between 1939 and 1945, the Indian independence struggle was either relatively dormant or completely dormant. And this occurred because in 1939, when the Congress, which essentially led the freedom movement, were in government in 8 out of India's then 11 provinces, and therefore in a commanding position as far as occupying the political space in India. But in September of that year, Britain declared war on Germany and dragged India into the war. That being the case, the Congress protested against India being dragged into the war without being consulted. And as a mark of protest, all 8 of their provincial governments resigned in October of 1939, and thereby, as I said, voluntarily vacated the space that they were occupying. Then briefly, for a few months in 1942, occurred what many of you will be aware of, the Quit India movement. But this too was quite brutally crushed by the British. And at the end of it, the Congress was actually banned as an organization. Most of their leaders and many of their workers were imprisoned for the remainder of the war. And therefore, the question as to how was it that the freedom movement was revived after the Second World War. And let me begin, though, by saying this, that there's virtual unanimity among historians of consequence that the Indian National Congress's monumental struggle from 1885 to 1947 was largely instrumental in securing Indian independence. In other words, the Congress's mass, non-violent, non-cooperation, and civil disobedience, devised and spearheaded by Mohandas Gandhi, better known as the Mahatma or Great Soul, is deemed to have been more successful than any other movement to ensure Britain's exit from India. That is not to say there weren't other efforts to pursue the same objective. Among these, arguably, the most significant was the INA campaign. This audaciously attempted to liberate India by engaging the British Indian Army on India's northeastern front. The INA was defeated, but the trial of its men at Delhi's symbolic Red Fort so angered Indians that a continuation much longer of British hegemony over India became almost impossible. Subhash Bose, a former president of the Congress, who spearheaded the INA, derived ideas and drew inspiration from previous instances of use of force by Indian nationalists. In the first of my chapters, I illustrate such instances, notably the 1857 mutiny, but also revolutionary activities within India and the transnational Ghadar movement in the 20th century. I do so for the sake of better understanding the INA, the trials, and the related Indian sentiments that impacted on Britain. From examples of use of force evolved Bose's concept of a military campaign from outside India at a time when the Gandhian struggle inside the country had come to a standstill. This was so because of a ban on the Congress by the British and widespread incarceration of its leaders and workers as retaliation to Gandhi's 1942 Quit India movement. Educated at Cambridge, Bose was quite a charismatic left-wing leader. In 1938, he was unanimously elected as one of the youngest presidents of the Congress. The 7th March 1938 issue of Time magazine portrayed him on its cover. It reported, quote, "Among the slick, satisfied top handful of Congress politicians, most of them obviously enjoying the incense of power and prestige. Subhash Bose stands out, unquote. But there arose a conflict between Bose and Gandhi, who was still the supreme leader of the Congress. Bose's uncompromising opposition to British rule and socialist leanings clashed with Gandhi's non-militancy and the Congress's right wing. They hardened their opposition to granting Bose a second term as president. Bose was, however, re-elected. The unthinkable had happened. Gandhi's will had not prevailed on the Congress. The Mahatma smarted, quote, "Since I was instrumental in inducing Dr. Pattavi Sitharamaiah, Bose's opponent, not to withdraw from the contest, the defeat is more mine than his," unquote. At his second anointing as Congress president, Bose was missing from the podium, struck by pneumonia. In his absence, a motion was passed binding him to form the new working committee, the party's highest decision-making body, quote, "in accordance with the wishes," unquote, of Gandhi. That was obviously humiliating for Bose. Jawaharlal Nehru, a fellow left-winger in the Congress, later to become India's first prime minister, expressed the view that the Mahatma should accept Bose as president. He said, quote, "To try to push him out seems to me to be an exceedingly wrong step," unquote. Nonetheless, on the 29th of April, 1939, Bose resigned as Congress president. On the 29th of November, 1940, back at his second home, a British prison, Bose commenced an indefinite hunger strike at Calcutta's Presidency Jail. A week later, with his health deteriorating, he was allowed to return to his residence in the city. The governor of Bengal, John Herbert, stated Bose was, quote, "neither in custody nor on bail," unquote. Plainclothed policemen kept watch on Bose's house. But on the night of the 16th of January, 1941, Bose, disguised as a Pathan, dramatically escaped from the premises. 10 days later, he had slipped into Afghanistan, which was beyond British jurisdiction. Traveling through Central Asia, he reached Moscow, from where, on the 2nd of April, 1941, he took a flight to Berlin. No matter how imperative the need for India's freedom, the adage of an enemy of one's enemy being a friend was difficult to defend in the case of Adolf Hitler. Bose's sole meeting with the Führer was predictably a disaster. Besides, his proposal for a German endorsement of Indian independence was turned down by Hitler. Bose described the dictator as, quote, "raving mad," unquote. Yet the stain of having sought Nazi Germany's support was hard to erase. In effect, Bose's 22 months in Germany were futile, other than a blissful reunion with his Austrian partner, Emilia Schenkel, and the birth of their daughter, Anita, now a retired professor of economics in Germany. On the 9th of February, 1943, Bose set sail on a submarine voyage to arrive in Southeast Asia on the 6th of May, 1943. On the 12th of June, 1943, Bose called on the Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo in Tokyo and made an immediate impression on him. Tojo told the Diet, the Japanese parliament, quote, "We firmly resolve that Japan will do everything possible to help Indian independence," unquote. The end of 1942 had seen the Axis powers successful almost everywhere. The German general Erwin Rommel was in Egypt. The rising sun was at its zenith from Japan to the Bay of Bengal. My second chapter is on the INA, its formation, fight, and failure, which led to the trials. After the fall of British-held Singapore to the Japanese on the 17th of February, 1942, about 40,000 Indians in the British-commanded Indian Army, who were now Japanese prisoners of war, motivated by Japanese intelligence, formed the first INA. Within a year, though, this outfit became practically ineffective. Bose's arrival in Singapore in May 1943, though, transformed the ambivalence to enthusiasm among the soldiers. His establishment of a provisional government of Free India in 1943 October gave the INA a legitimacy that it had lacked before. Hugh Toy, a British intelligence officer assigned to track down Bose in Southeast Asia, in his later biography of Bose entitled The Springing Tiger, commented, quote, "Soldiers and civilians were ready for him, and they welcomed him boisterously," unquote. Bose's compact with the Japanese was also controversial. It signified aligning with an imperialist power, Japan, to combat another, Britain. The Japanese may have subdued British forces in the East, but had themselves been authoritarian and expansionist. Moreover, there was a difference in perspectives between the INA and the Japanese army. For the INA, it was a one-point agenda to liberate India, utilizing Burma as a staging post. The Japanese objective, on the other hand, was to forestall a British offensive to retake Burma, which had fallen to the Japanese in December 1941. In fact, the directive issued on the 7th of January 1944 by the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo to the Japanese Southern Army in Southeast Asia was, quote, to capture areas near Imphal, which is in India, and in northeastern India for the defense of Burma, unquote. The INA, as a junior partner of the Japanese army, did see action and briefly controlled small parts of Indian territory, but it was beaten back by British commanded forces both in 1944 and 1945. Muhammad Zaman Kiani, a major in the British Indian Army, who became the INA's senior-most field commander, maintained in his book, India's Freedom Struggle and the Great INA, quote, "The Japanese attack on Imphal in 1944, without a doubt came within an ace of success," unquote. But the winds of war had changed. The Japanese were on the defensive by the end of 1943, and durable success was hard to come by. Kiani explained, quote, "The Japanese Bushido spirit and samurai tradition was still intact, but their home industry could not keep pace with the continuously increasing demands of the vast fighting fronts spread over the Pacific Ocean and the Indian and Chinese theaters of war. There was also the very important question of advanced technology. It can clearly be stated that the Allied, particularly American technology, was improving more rapidly than the Japanese. The Americans had also succeeded in breaking the Japanese secret naval code, unquote. Nevertheless, when Indians learned about the INA's endeavor, after censorship of news was lifted in India in August 1945, they reacted hysterically to what they interpreted as dauntless heroism. Defeat was dismissed as immaterial. Daring to wage war against the mighty British was looked upon by Indians as estimable enough. Gandhi, hitherto a critic of Bose, not to mention of violence, proclaimed, quote, "The hypnotism of the Indian National Army has cast a spell on us," unquote. The British Labour Party was elected to power in July 1945. In a cabinet meeting the following month, Prime Minister Clement Attlee explained why his government couldn't forgive Bose's INA. Nothing could be worse for the British, he said, quote, than to let the impression grow that rebellion was an easy thing that need not be taken too seriously, unquote. So the ball was set rolling to try those who had defected from the British Indian Army to the INA for treason in an exemplary fashion for Indians to witness at close quarters. The third and fourth chapters of my book deal with the first and most famous trial, Blow by Blow, and the repercussions to it. The Viceroy of India, Lord Archibald Wavell, informed London on the 31st of October 1945, quote, "There is great bitterness against the INA generally in the Indian Army," unquote. He was forwarding an assessment by General Sir Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief of Armed Forces in India, which said, quote, "I am strongly of the opinion that although men may be tried for other crimes, the general feeling throughout the army would be that they must be tried as traitors also," unquote. The Congress constituted a committee of 17 lawyers to defend the accused. They forewarned Wavell before the first landmark trial that the decision to hold it, quote, "will have far-reaching repercussions throughout the length and breadth of India. So deep and widespread is the appreciation of the motives and aims of the movement, of which the Indian National Army was an expression," unquote. Gandhi lent his voice to the entreaty. He asked Wavell, quote, "Can the government afford to ignore the almost, if not the wholly unanimous opinion of Indians of all shades of opinion," unquote. A dormitory in the military barracks at Delhi's Red Fort was converted into a courtroom. 7 British Indian Army officers, 4 Britons and 3 Indians, comprised the bench of judges. The trial got underway on the 5th of November, 1945, with 3 former Indian Army officers who had switched allegiance to the INA, Captains Shahnawaz Khan and Prem Sehgal, and Lieutenant Gurbaksh Dhillon, charged with waging war against the British King George VI. When asked how they pleaded, they emphatically answered, "Not guilty." The choice of accused by the British in what was a showpiece trial was unwittingly a Himalayan blunder. Khan was a Muslim, Sehgal a Hindu, and Dhillon a Sikh, representing the 3 prominent Indian communities. India detonated with a united fury. On the 16th of November, 1945, a mere 11 days into the trial, Wavell, writing from his palatial premises in New Delhi to the British Secretary of State for India, Lord Frederick Pethick Lawrence, struck a drastically different note about the trial from the one only about a fortnight earlier. Quote, "I have just had a letter from the commander-in-chief, namely Auchinleck, expressing grave concern at the possible effect on the army of the INA trials, unquote. 4 days later, therefore, on the 20th of November, 1945, came an alarming secret note from the director of the Indian Intelligence Bureau, Sir Norman Smith, to Wavell and the India Office in London. It warned, quote, the possibility of the development of the agitation, that is the public unrest, in dangerous directions exists in a degree which demands constant watchfulness. And the threat to the security of the Indian army is one which would be unwise to ignore, unquote. He also reported, quote, the appearance of threatening posters, unquote, in Calcutta and Delhi, vowing 20 English deaths for every INA man hanged. Sir Norman cautioned that this, quote, does not make the position in respect of Europeans as satisfactory as could be wished, unquote. The next day, the 21st of November, 1945, violent protests erupted in Calcutta and continued for several days. Dozens and dozens died as police opened fire on Hindu and Muslim demonstrators who, after decades of mutual animosity, were suddenly on the same page. The governor of Bengal was forced to summon the army to support police. On the 24th of November 1945, in the midst of the Calcutta riots, Auchinleck communicated to Wavell, quote, after careful consideration, I feel that reconsideration is the wisest. The evidence reaching us now increasingly goes to show that the general opinion in the army is in favor of leniency, unquote. A court-martial under the then Indian Army Act could only administer one of two sentences in matters of treason, a death penalty or life imprisonment. Auchinleck, in his note, was already considering clemency. He argued, quote, if the sentence is to be commuted, it can only be on the grounds that the men acted in good faith, and in that case, it would be illogical to imprison them, unquote. This was a stunning climb down in just 3.5 weeks, from branding the INA men as traitors to accepting they might have acted in good faith. Wavell agreed with Auchinleck's line of action, and so, camouflaged from the Indian and British public, Operation Backtrack was initiated. On the 1st of December, 1945, in the middle of the trial, Auchinleck received Nehru. It was an unusual gesture, a commander-in-chief of imperial armed forces entertaining a relentless opponent of empire, especially when Nehru was in an overtly implacable mood. But it was statesmanship on the part of the general. The London Times, carrying an Associated Press report the following day, recorded, quote, he, namely Nehru, said that stories of exploits of the Indian National Army had led many younger Indians to question the Gandhi philosophy of nonviolence. Many of them were now thinking about the possibility of force as a means of gaining independence, unquote. The agitation against the trial intensified as the hearing progressed. Bhulabhai Desai, a Congress activist and Bombay lawyer, was entrusted with the task of defending Khan, Sehgal, and Dhillon. And his was a heroic performance, which held Indians transfixed for 2 months and stirred them to a boiling point. Desai argued, quote, "Here is a case in which I venture to say, and the evidence supports it, that it is not at all a case of what you might call three individuals waging war against the king. The evidence amply bears out the fact that these men charged before you were a part of an organized army which waged war against the king, even according to the prosecution. What is now on trial before the court is the right to wage war with immunity on the part of a subject race for their liberation," unquote. Desai submitted that the matter came under international law, for it had been a war between the British government and the provisional government of Free India, which the INA represented. He cited the American Declaration of Independence and pleaded, quote, "There was before the American people a conflict between the allegiance to the King of England and allegiance to their country. And they chose allegiance to their country in preference to allegiance to a foreign king," unquote. The military tribunal heard from the Advocate General of India, Sir Naushirwan Engineer, who asserted, quote, "I submit that all charges against all the accused have been proved beyond any reasonable doubt. There is no defense in law to the charges against the accused," unquote. Then came a strange doublespeak. Quote, "There is a good deal of evidence," he said, "to the effect that what the accused did was done by them not with any mercenary motive, but out of what the accused bona fide consider to be patriotic motives, and impelled by a sense, whether wise or misguided, of doing service to India," unquote. The accused were found, quote, "guilty of the charge of waging war against the King Emperor," unquote. On the matter of sentencing, the court's hands were patently tied. It pronounced life imprisonments for all three defendants. However, as the confirming officer, Auchinleck decided, quote, to remit the sentences, unquote. Desai lost in the courtroom, but prevailed at the court of public opinion. He swayed Indians, even a section of Britons in the British Indian Army, and persuaded the commander-in-chief, Auchinleck himself, to change his mind. On the 12th of February 1946, in a note to general officer commanding-in-chiefs under him, Auchinleck laid threadbare that, quote, "any attempt to enforce the sentence would have led to chaos in the country at large and probably mutiny and dissension in the army, culminating in its dissolution." On the 2nd of March 1946, the Indian daily The Statesman quoted Nehru as effectively corroborating what Auchinleck had said, in that Khan, Sehgal, and Dhillon, quote, "were not released owing to demonstrations in India, but because the Indian army had demanded their release," unquote. He also said in an earlier statement that a lot of donations towards the cost of the defense of the three were coming from soldiers in the British-commanded Indian Army. Earlier, in a foreword to a book publishing the transcript of the trial, Nehru wrote, quote, "No trial in India, either by court-martial or in the civil courts, has attracted so much public attention or has dealt with issues of such fundamental national importance. Those three officers and the Indian National Army became symbols of India fighting for her independence, a trial of strength between the will of the Indian people and the will of those who hold power in India. And it was the will of the Indian people that triumphed in the end, unquote. Intelligence inputs about the disconcerting public mood in India, followed by the Calcutta riots, which were uncontrollable, as I said, for several days, and then Auchinleck's second thoughts about the trials resulted in Whitehall extending a hand of conciliation. On the 4th of December 1945, Pethick Lawrence made a statement in the House of Lords. The Times reported, quote, "The government regarded the setting up of a constitution-making body in India as a matter of greatest urgency," unquote, but added, quote, "The statement contained a warning against any attempt to resolve the constitutional issue by force," unquote. Another headline in the Times, correspondingly from New Delhi, was, quote, "Congress Party coolness," unquote. The Congress felt the lecture on law and order was uncalled for. Public outrage in India over the trial rumbled on. So, on New Year's Day, 1946, Pethick Lawrence reached out to Indians again, this time over the airwaves. The Times reported, quote, "He, the Secretary of State for India, believed the whole British people earnestly desired to see India rise quickly to the full and free status of an equal partner in the British Commonwealth. There was no longer any need for denunciations or organized pressure to secure recognition of India's due position in the world," unquote. The new formulation of equal partner in the British Commonwealth meant persevering with the king, that is King George VI, as India's head of state. This was unacceptable to the Congress. Behind the scenes, though, work had begun in London to conceive concrete measures to meet Indian aspirations. The situation worsened. On the 18th of February, 1946, mutiny broke out in the ranks of the Royal Indian Navy. A commission of inquiry into the revolt later concluded that contact with the INA, the trial of its men and political meetings, which whipped up pro-INA and patriotic sentiments, were among the factors that rendered the mutiny a political complexion. The British Sunday Times, carrying a dispatch from Delhi on the 24th of February, described that, quote, "Strong racial feeling against the British, temporarily submerging the traditional Hindu-Muslim differences, undoubtedly underlines the recent outbursts of mob violence and naval indiscipline," unquote. The All India Congress Committee, at its annual session in Lahore in 1929, passed a motion demanding Purna Swaraj, or complete independence. British authorities, though, paid no attention to the resolution until in 1942, when Japanese forces had swept through Southeast Asia and arrived at India's doorstep in Burma. Sir Stafford Cripps, a Labour minister in the war cabinet of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, visited India with a mission to offer conditional dominion status. This was rejected by the Congress. King George VI, in his address at the opening of Parliament in August 1945, said, quote, "In accordance with the promises already made to my Indian peoples, my government will do their utmost to promote, in conjunction with the leaders of Indian opinion, the early realization of full self-government in India," unquote. Self-government, of course, still meant dominion status. On the 5th of November, 1945, in other words, the day of the epoch-making first INA trial, the day it began, that is, Britain was still only prepared to concede dominion status. In a matter of 18 weeks, however, this position quite remarkably changed to complete independence. My final chapter portrays the speed with which matters moved in London in the aftermath of the trial to culminate in an acceptance of the principle of complete independence. On the 15th of March, 1946, Prime Minister Attlee told the House of Commons, quote, "I hope that the Indian people may elect to remain within the British Commonwealth. Yet, if, on the other hand, she elects for independence, in our view, she has a right to do so," unquote. For the first time in Britain's rule of India since 1757, the word independence had been uttered at any important level of the British government, whether in Britain or in India. That too from the pedestal of the UK's Prime Minister. In the same statement, Attlee informed the House that the idea of nationalism in India had, quote, "spread right through, and not least perhaps among some of those soldiers who had done such wonderful service in the war," unquote, referring to the British commanded Indian Armed Forces. He could not have been clearer that the phenomenon of the INA trials triggering the naval and other mutinies had disturbed the devotion of Indian soldiers in the British commanded armed forces. Therefore, I respectfully commend the book to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Ray, for that very detailed analysis of both the backdrop to the INA trials as well as the profound impact that it had, to the extent that you argue it hastened Indian independence after World War II. So now I think we have around roughly half an hour or so for question and answer. So the floor is open. I don't see any hands yet.
Yeah.
Okay. Why don't you start?
Sir, do I address you as professor? Because it said just Mr. You couldn't just be Mr.
No, I'm not even Mr. I'm just. If you are respectful, then you can say Mr. But it doesn't matter.
I'll stick to sir. But thank you for that wonderful talk, and it's something that I actually, to be honest, perhaps many of us did not know much about, or knew just snippets of information and not the the details that you just provided. So thank you very much for that, and for it. I wanted to just ask you that in terms of the narrative that you have, you mentioned 2-3 parts. First was Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, then the INA, then the trial, and then the very quick movement from the trial to independence. So, in your view, was the trial sort of the main reason why Britain decided to, grant us independence so quickly? Because in 1945, when the war ended, I would imagine that at that time, the trial, let's say in August 15th, when the war ended, 1945, perhaps the British might have thought that they'd be ruling India for several more years. And perhaps that was one of the reasons why Auchinleck wanted to have the trial, to make sure that they had a loyal army. And then suddenly,
all hell broke loose, as you described very eloquently, the support of the Indian people and of the Indian army of what the INA had done. So do you think that was the main reason that resulted in all the changes, all the concessions given in early 1946, the cabinet mission and the MPs who visited, and then they said that, as you said, that India's almost lost, basically. So do you think that was the main reason that this happened at that time, or were there other factors as well?
The cabinet mission came later, by which stage Attlee had already made his announcement in the House
March
of Congress,
46,
and it followed. But obviously, what became evident is that Britain was prepared to grant dominion status. I don't think there was a problem regarding that. In fact, as far back as the late 30s, round about 1938, there was a meeting in England between Attlee and Nehru, Attlee was then the leader of opposition, a leader of the Labour Party. And even at that meeting, which was in the country residence of Pethick Lawrence, Attlee had indicated that if Labour came to power, then a Labour government would grant dominion status. And even in the election manifesto of 1945, the July 1945 general election in Britain, the manifesto does pledge dominion status to India. So that was really the British position. And what happened quite dramatically as a consequence of the trial was this, that they were dragged somewhat kicking and screaming into agreeing to the principle of complete independence, because crucially, the loyalty of Indians in the British commanded armed forces could no longer be taken for granted. And in such circumstances, there was little option but to concede to the demand for complete independence, which, by the way, as I said, was a demand since 1929. And it was a demand which had been ignored for 13 years. And then under duress with the Japanese at India's doorstep, Britain agreed to dominion status. But that was as far as they were prepared to go at the start of the trial. But circumstances, people's reactions, and then the rumblings within the armed forces, the actual mutiny that took place in the Royal Indian Navy, these certainly contributed to a fairly swift decision on the part of Attlee. I give a lot of credit to two figures. One is Auchinleck and the other is Attlee, for their ability to grasp the seriousness of the situation, because there were two things which were worrying them. One was that it could have been not just a repeat of 1857, but it could be much worse if things went out of control. And then, of course, if the armed forces rebelled, then, there was no future for Britain in India. So that is really what happened. And fundamentally, of course, the foundation for the freedom movement was laid by the Gandhian movement, because Gandhi was able to convert an elitist movement into a mass movement, and that laid the foundation. But what was very troubling in the 20th century was the increasing divide between the two main communities, Hindus and Muslims. And during that period of 39 to 1945, with the Congress taking a backseat, the communal forces, both on the Muslim side and the Hindu side, they ran amok. So that was a lot of damage to the fabric of unity in the country. And briefly, strangely, for those 5 months, as Nehru has said on record, that never before and never after has India been so united. So that was the period from September roughly to February
Of 46.
45, 46. Yeah.
Okay. One last question, sir, may I?
Yeah, if you keep it very brief.
Okay. So you mentioned Mohan Singh and Rash Bihari Bose. Who are these two people?
Well, I mean, he
Oh,
mentioned Mohan Singh, as I said,
Of course, I'm
it
asking
was the
that-
Japanese, Raj Bihari Bose was president of what was known as the Indian Independence League. The Indian Independence League operated in many countries and in Southeast Asia, East Asia. And he was the president before he handed over this mantle to Subhash Bose, when Subhash came to this part of the world. Mohan Singh was made leader of the INA when it was first formed in 1942. And the Japanese intelligence had gone to prisoners of war. I mean, this being the background that Britain lost to Japanese forces, meaning the British commanded Indian army, lost in Malaya and Singapore. And so they became prisoners of war. And the Japanese intelligence officers went to them and said that, you have an option to either remain as prisoners of war or to fight for India's liberation. And so that's the genesis of the INA, but it quickly fizzled out until Subhash came in 1943, revived the INA and made it into certainly quite an important force, although they lacked equipment, but they had the spirit, but obviously lost.
I believe Mohan Singh had given a fairly famous address at Fire Park in Singapore, if I'm not wrong. Anyway, so we have more hands. Professor Rajesh Ray.
Yeah, thank you so much for that and for that very compelling narrative on how important the trial was in speeding India's independence. Now, even as we tell this story of the centrality of the trial, I'm wondering if there are other facets that perhaps need consideration, or perhaps you may have also reflected on in your book, which I have not read. And that is that the trial aside and the tremendous propaganda that it generated, that's one side of the story, but the revolt of the soldiers of the Navy can also, to some extent, and I'm wondering if you might want to consider that, be about how the Royal Navy was involved in liberating several parts of Southeast Asia from Japanese control. So coming back, retaking Singapore, during which time many of these soldiers also came to be acquainted with the INA. And while the trial is emblematic, there's something to be said about the kind of connections that were established between INA soldiers based in Singapore, in Malaya, perhaps in other parts of Burma, in Rangoon, and the effect this had on the thinking of the Royal Navy sailors, and then leading and influencing their revolt as well, which would have been, of course, been very influential in hurting a key pillar of the empire. And I'm wondering if your work touches on this.
Yes, it's virtually an entire chapter on the naval mutiny, although I see it as an offshoot of the trial. It's a very important development, without any doubt. But there were two factors which kind of differentiated the two. One was the trial held center stage for 2 months. 2 months. Almost every day during that period, you had banner headlines in newspapers. And as I mentioned, that Bhulabhai Desai really had people eating out of his fingers. And then, of course, comes the mutiny, which lasts about 5-6 days. And of course, there is considerable violence in the streets of Bombay. But it does not grab the headlines to the extent the trial did. That's one. There were reasons for that. One was, coincidentally, the mutiny began on the 18th of February 1946. The very next day came the announcement of the cabinet mission from London, and therefore the headlines were being shared between these two stories. The cabinet mission, which gave Indians hope of a transfer of power fairly soon, and this, so it didn't get the kind of headlines that the trial did. And then no sooner the mutiny ended, came news about famine in Western and Southern India. And that again took the spotlight away from the mutiny. And therefore, as I said, while it certainly contributed to the thinking in London, this loyalty factor, that it could no longer be taken for granted, but it did not have the kind of impact on public minds as the trial did.
I see another hand. Could I just add something to Rajesh's question? He was talking about the propaganda, the coverage, and you mentioned the coverage of the trial. How spontaneous were the sort of protests and violence that were happening? Was there an organized element, or was it sort of happening quite organically?
I think quite spontaneously. I mean, this is very interesting because Professor Bipan Chandra says that almost every village in the country knew about the INA and the trial. I mean, that was the extent of penetration of what was going on. And so the Nehru factor is important in parallel to Bhulabhai Desai, because while Bhulabhai Desai was arguing the case in court, Nehru was going from rally to rally in the country, whipping up emotions. So that combination certainly was quite deadly for the British. And then, of course, as you said, I mean, this is the extent to which it penetrated down to people was quite startling for the British. They simply could not control it. And it wasn't just Indian-owned newspapers. Even British-owned newspapers like the Statesman and the Times of India, and I think even the Indian Express, were giving ample coverage to the story. And not to forget, the British press. So the Guardian, the Times, the Observer, the Sunday Times were all giving plenty of coverage. So there was no dearth of coverage, to being given to the trial.
Yeah,
one more, just because it continues on what you're saying. There's one aspect which I also feel that there is insufficient evidence and perhaps calls into question a bit on how spontaneous this was, because agents were being sent. So on one side, you hear the story of the INA in Imphal, but agents were being sent by the INA into India a long time before. Some armed, some carrying munitions, even bombs, which when this so-called spontaneous or potentially spontaneous thing broke out, many of these agents were also involved in this. I've heard of this from INA people themselves. It's not something that I've gone in further because the nature of the information is very divided, right? It's all over the place. But this is just something that needs to be unpacked a little more.
I mean, of course, the British said that this was being organized. But in the instance of the Calcutta riots, for instance, and that was the sort of peak, as it were, in terms of disturbances. There were lesser riots, lesser degrees of agitation taking place all over the country. There was no part of India which was not agitated about what was going on. But in the case of the Calcutta riots, for instance, the Congress was blamed for it, but the Congress actually appealed to the public to stop the riots. And certainly I wouldn't say it was organized. It was quite spontaneous, and quite remarkably, Hindus and Muslims were absolutely together on those days, which was remarkable given the history that had occurred immediately before all this.
I'll come back to it. Sandeep,
Yeah.
a colleague
Hi.
of mine at ISAS has been waiting patiently. Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much for this very interesting topic and definitely very understudied topic. I had a couple of questions. One was, I see the point that by the end of it, INA becomes a very emotive issue and nationalists use it to mobilize the politically mobilized public. But in the beginning of this process, is there any hesitation in embracing, and to what degree should we embrace this topic? Because I'm thinking that on the face of it, there are also reasons to be wary of this, right? I mean, there is the whole idea of Indian army did fight them, right? Like Indian soldiers did fight INA, and you yourself mentioned that Auchinleck has a very different assessment before the process starts of what Indian army thinks of these people. Then there is also the thing that it goes against the non-violence Gandhian non-violence, the non-militaristic approach generally that nationalist movement has. Factors like that, right? Like there are the idea of the old Gandhi-Bose differences in general. So is there a concern? Is there in the beginning some sense of discomfort with this idea? Is there at any point any debate within the Congress or in political mainstream about, that to what degree should we embrace this?
It's a very good point. Yeah.
A second question.
Yeah, and I mean, and the second question is that I was just wondering, and this is again, this is my sense, correct me if you think that I'm wrong here, but my sense is that in Southeast Asia, INA and Azad Hind people are treated more leniently. The Mountbatten's British military administration here doesn't really go that strongly after them. They're released very quickly after they're arrested and things like that. And in general, also in the British Empire, the collaborators are not treated that harshly. I mean, Aung San fought with the Japanese. He raised an army for the Japanese, and after that, the British dealt with him, right? I mean, they negotiated with him for independence. So why do you think there's a difference, if I'm correct in this? I mean, this was just a sense, so I may be wrong, but why do you think that the empire treated collaboration differently in India than it did in other parts of the empire?
To come to your second question first, some people were summarily executed. This was admitted in the Indian Central Assembly by the British government. The names of these people were never talked about. So it did happen in Burma, particularly. Now, thereafter, 800 people were shortlisted for trial within the INA. And so this was the first of the trials. And there were obviously many others to follow. Ultimately, when the whole thing was called off in early May of 1946, called off altogether, only maybe 36 people had undergone trial, so no more than that. I do take your point that in Southeast Asia, that the British were lenient, but Mountbatten did something which was probably not the right thing to do, that he demolished the INA Memorial here in Singapore. Now, you may have won the war, but you should not be unkind to your opponents who have fallen as soldiers. So that was one element. Now, the Congress had reservations about Subhash Bose's alliance with Japan. Absolutely right. So what happened was, in August 1945, so the war ends, the Second World War finally comes to an end on the 15th of August 1945 with the surrender of Japan. And then slowly, one by one, the Congress leaders start coming out of prison. And they're a bit shell-shocked. They don't have much of an idea on what to do to revive the movement. But then within a month, they realize this huge anger and outrage has developed among people who had come to know about the INA campaign for the first time. Because during the war, this matter had been kept out from the public domain. And so, with this public mood being so foul, the Congress realized that here is an opportunity. So therefore, in September of 1945, took place the first post-war All India Congress Committee session in Bombay. And that's where they, first of all, they chose to uphold and embrace the INA campaign. That's one. And secondly, to oppose the trials. And that's how they embraced it. But that was not the Congress's original position. It's just that they realized that the mood of the people is such that there was no way they could ignore that feeling. And secondly, and most importantly, it immediately rejuvenated the freedom movement.
Right. You had something to
Actually,
add.
my question has been answered by your answer to the gentleman's question. But relating to what you mentioned, in Southeast Asia, most of the volunteers were civilians who had not sworn any oath of loyalty to George VI. So they were not guilty of treason. That's why most of them were not, there were no trials here about joining the INA. Whereas the trials in India, as I
Yeah,
said,
they were civilians who had
yeah,
joined.
yeah.
Yes, correct.
so as,
Including, women who joined the Rani of Jhansi regiment of the INA. Yeah.
Right. I don't see any. Rajesh, do you?
Yeah, in this regard on Congress's reservations, and I think it's worthwhile also talking about that, given that they embraced it after the trial. Right in 1943, there is constant desire to get Congress acknowledgement and support for the INA. And I see this people waiting for declarations. Gandhi was still a very popular figure here, but they never came. I mean, despite the fact that the garrisons or the regiments were named after Gandhi and so on. So the effect of Congress staying away from the INA right in a period that was very crucial for the INA also stands.
Yes, if I may just add to what you said, that there were several appeals by Subhash Bose in radio addresses from Burma directed at Indian listeners, where he appeals, in fact, particularly in one instance to Gandhi for his blessings. He uses the word blessings. I seek your blessings as we are about to embark on this campaign. So yes, and it was not forthcoming. It only came after the war. As I said, Gandhi's statements were quite different from what they were earlier. And of course, what I have noticed in my research is that of all the Congress leaders, Nehru came closest to identifying with Bose. And not so much the others. Gandhi, of course, was correct. He was very correct in what he was saying. But I mean, for instance, in the case of Vallabhbhai Patel, who opposed the mutiny, for instance, he was negotiating on behalf of the British government to call off the mutiny. Yes, yeah, the naval mutiny. Yeah. So, but Nehru, and even in that instance, Nehru went to Bombay, and his statement was that that the sailors, and soldiers were Indians first. He emphasized that, because the question was asked that, how can you do this in uniform? And so he replied. This was at a press conference in Bombay, and he replied that they are Indians first, and therefore they have a right to fight for freedom.
Right. I think I don't see any more hands in round of questions. I just had one last question before we wind up. Since the issue of the harshness or leniency, whatever it is, of the of British Indian administration. If you sort of so, what was the eventual sort of sentencing of, say, the three people who were tried, and if you sort of compare that to, I think you briefly mentioned somewhere, and this is something I've been working on. If you compare it to the early 20th century revolutionaries during the Swadeshi movement, etc. Of course, there were quite a few who were executed after trial, but there were others, like, say, Aurobindo Ghosh's brother, Barin Ghosh, etc., who were actually sent off to the Andamans and spent several years under extremely, difficult conditions. Some of them have, of course, wrote their memoirs, etc. Of course, this was a different time. It was separated by almost 40 odd years. So yeah, so a question on the actual sentencing.
Yeah, exactly. So clemency was granted. In other words, the life sentences were overturned, but they were cashiered, and therefore they lost their benefits, their back salaries, and the benefits that they would have accrued as previously soldiers of the Indian Army, and they were not taken back into the Indian Army either in India or in Pakistan, or rather, one taken back into the army either in India or Pakistan. So even in Pakistan, a lot of them, I mean, I mentioned Zaman Kiani, for instance. Now, Zaman Kiani, a brilliant soldier, but he wasn't formally ever taken back into the army. He ultimately became a politician and became Minister of Information and Broadcasting, Kiani, but they were not taken back into the army. So they lost their salaries and benefits, as I said.
They don't have to serve any kind of prison.
No, nothing. I should mention this, though. Again, a cause of friction. So the Congress defended most of the soldiers who were accused, even the limited number who actually went to trial. But there was this one instance of a soldier, Captain Rashid, being defended by the Muslim League. And as it happened, because the Muslim League also, by the way, they set up a defense committee. But most soldiers chose to be defended by the Congress rather than the Muslim League. But in this instance, it was Captain Rashid, and he was given a sentence of a few months. It was not for treason, but it was for another crime that he had committed, treating his fellow soldiers and so on. That was one of the brutality and things like that were the charges against him. So he did receive a sentence of about 3 to 5 months. And that's where Muhammad Ali Jinnah was very annoyed. And he said that the British are being biased towards the Congress. And so that was February of 1946, when the unity began to fray, the unity between Hindus and Muslims, because he took this up as a Muslim cause, as injustice to the Muslims, and that the British were showing bias towards the Congress, and with the famous 3 being released, whereas in this instance, the man being sentenced and actually serving his sentence. So he did raise that, and that certainly was the beginning of, once again, the situation returning to a sort of status quo ante in terms of relations between Hindus and Muslims.
Right. I think we've run out of time. So if there are any further questions, we can, of course, ask Mr. Ray, once we are formally done. So so I must call it a day, even though we have several questions. And could we have a round of applause once again for? Thank you.